In the year of our Lord 1300 and something, when the bells of every parish rang not in harmony but in complaint of the weather, there arose among men a peculiar fascination with the art of lawmaking. The kingdom, being otherwise occupied with plagues, crusades, and an alarming shortage of clean water, found its greatest pastime not in merriment but in decrees. Every petty quarrel, every accidental sneeze before a noble, every uninvited goose upon the manor green gave birth to another regulation. No one truly remembered who began this fashion, but the scribes continued it with quiet, desperate pride. The first of the more memorable, though still remarkably tedious, occurrences came from the county of Norwich, where a cobbler named Edwin the Measured took great pride in producing the most elongated footwear in the realm. These shoes, called poulains, were of such monstrous proportion that they required small cords to be tied to the wearer's knees lest they trip over their own vanity. Edwin's work was admired by fools and envied by men of modest feet. One unfortunate feast day, Lord Humbert of Yarmouth attempted to walk from his table to the courtyard in a pair of Edwin's most ambitious creations, the tips of which extended nearly a cubit beyond the toes. Having drunk a gallant quantity of ale, Humbert stumbled, skewered the tapestry, collided with a minstrel, and, to the horror of onlookers, fell head first into the hearth. The fire did not forgive his intrusion. The tale, as it wandered from tavern to tavern, grew ever more absurd. Some swore that the shoes were possessed, others that the devil himself had sharpened the points. By the time it reached the royal council, it was decided, quite sensibly, that shoes should never again be longer than dignity itself. Thus the statute of shoes was written, in the driest script imaginable, decreeing that no man beneath the rank of lord might wear tips exceeding 2 inches, and even lords must beware of carpets and fire alike. The enforcement of this law fell to the guild of cordwainers, who, being fond of rules, established committees to measure every shoe in town. So it came to pass that for several tedious years, markets echoed with the sound of rulers slapping leather, arguments over fractions of inches, and disputes about whether a curled tip counted toward the lawful length. The law solved nothing, of course, but filled the archives with marvelous paperwork. Yet this was merely the dawn of madness. In the same century, when the moon was thought to influence not only tides but tempers, another calamity of such trivial importance unfolded that it deserved, by medieval logic, a royal decree. In a nameless village north of London, where men tilled poor soil and women gossiped about saints they had never met, the game of football took its rough, chaotic form. It was not a sport so much as an annual riot disguised as leisure. Entire parishes chased a pig's bladder across fields, over hedges, through streams, and occasionally through each other's windows. Bones were broken, fences demolished, and sermons postponed because the curate had lost a tooth in the melee. The climax came one foggy, Shrove Tuesday when 2 villages, Stokely and Brentford, met to decide ownership of the same tattered ball. The battle raged from morning till dusk. At some ill-considered moment, the ball rolled beneath the horse of a passing knight, Sir Reginald de Pike, who, startled and righteous, swung his sword to restore order. Instead, he struck the mayor of Brentford upon the helm, which being no helm but his actual skull, resulted in consequences that demanded legal attention. When the news reached King Edward III, he concluded that such diversions distracted from the noble art of archery, by which England was to defend itself from France. Thus the proclamation was issued, that no man shall engage in the playing of football or such idle games, under penalty of imprisonment, lest the kingdom fall to sloth and bruises. And so the law was read aloud in market squares by weary heralds, who were in turn pelted with the same pig bladders they condemned. The people listened politely, promised reform, and resumed play the next day. In time, a few were arrested, most escaped, and the prisons echoed with arguments about offside positions no one could define. Meanwhile, far away in the Shire of Kent, there occurred another affair equally tedious yet inexplicably influential. A carter named Thomas of Y, having loaded his wagon with hay and hope, allowed his oxen to wander unattended while he relieved himself behind a hedge. The beasts, being of independent mind, bolted down the road and, in their zeal, flattened a passing friar. The friar perished. The oxen, innocent of theology, chewed grass nearby. The villagers, unable to decide whom to blame, the absent carter, the unobservant friar, or Providence itself, appealed to the coroner. After much deliberation, it was declared that the oxen, as instruments of the fatality, must be forfeited to God. The beasts were seized, sold, and their value given to the church. Thus was born the principle of Deodand Law that any object causing death must be sacrificed for divine appeasement. Over time, this led to a veritable parade of pious absurdity. Carts, barrels, millstones, and even ladders were condemned and sold whenever they happened to assist mortality. Once an entire mill was declared guilty when a drunkard fell into it, prompting debates about whether the wind itself should be fined. The scribes who recorded these cases did so, with the dull precision of men paid by the line. Each parchment began alike. Be it known on this day that a certain object, lacking malice yet possessing weight, did occasion the untimely death of a subject of His Majesty, and so forth for page after dreary page. But the people, finding comfort in the notion that even a wheel could be punished, accepted it gladly. It offered a sense of cosmic order, that chaos itself could be fined into submission. And though the policy filled royal coffers, it also filled the countryside with whispered jokes, that a man might live forever if he avoided tools entirely. As decades dragged like monks' sandals, more curious laws appeared. In York, after a merchant's wife was startled by a goose that wandered into her parlor, the city council forbade the keeping of poultry within sight of a noblewoman. In Lincoln, a fishmonger's quarrel over a stolen eel led to the eel licensing ordinance, requiring seals, stamps, and signatures for the sale of any fish longer than a man's forearm. None remembered the reason after a generation, but the documents endured. Thus the archives grew vast, the parchment yellowed, and the kingdom became a museum of rules born from trifles. Each statute was a memorial to someone's embarrassment. A spilled drink, a broken window, a burnt curtain, or a misplaced cow. Monks copied these laws diligently, their quills scratching through winter nights while candles smoked and time itself seemed to sigh. The abbots praised them for preserving order. The novices prayed not to fall asleep mid-paragraph. Each copyist secretly wished for a simpler world, where sense might triumph over precedent, but that would have been heresy. And so life in the realm continued under the gentle tyranny of its own paperwork. Every accident hinted at another decree waiting to be born. A dropped spoon might become a statute, a sneezing horse a matter of royal concern. The people resigned, learned to live between the lines of the law, half amused, half asleep, and entirely lawful. By the time another century limped past, the land was thick with commandments. Every borough had its parchment tower, every reeve his collection of signatures no one could read. In the town of Mildred, the officials prided themselves on having more laws than chickens. They enforced each with sober ceremony and a total absence of enthusiasm. It began one spring morning when a mason named Bartram slipped from a church scaffold while attempting to carve a saint's nose. He landed not upon earth as one might hope, but upon the mayor's mule, which promptly bolted through the marketplace and into a stall of pickled onions. Bartram survived with bruises. The mule did not. The onions, being unsupervised, rolled into the river and caused further uproar. A council met for 3 days to determine who was responsible for the mule's death and the onion shortage. The debate was as long as it was pointless. At last they produced the Act of Proper Scaffolding, a document so dense that even its author fell asleep before finishing it. It required that all future scaffolds be inspected by a licensed height observer, a position invented on the spot. Mildred thus employed 12 men whose sole duty was to stand beneath ladders and nod thoughtfully. While this innovation spread across counties, another calamity befell the realm. In the cathedral city of Ely, a monk named Brother Cuthbert devoted himself to the keeping of bees. The honey used for mead and medicine was prized beyond reason. One fateful summer, a visiting bishop tasted the honey, praised it, and ordered several jars for his journey home. Unfortunately, he neglected to secure the lids. Along the dusty road, the bees, insulted by imprisonment, escaped and attacked a passing bridal procession. The bride's veil caught fire from a dropped torch. The guests scattered, and the bishop's wagon overturned into a ditch. In the wake of this chaos, the synod declared a bee regulation charter, commanding that no ecclesiastical honey be transported without holy supervision, and that all jars be sealed with wax bearing the diocesan crest. Every abbey thereafter appointed a keeper of bee seals, a role both dull and sticky. For decades, clerks documented the number of bees per hive and the piety of each swarm, just in case. Meanwhile, in the south, the coastal village of Merthyr was consumed by another trivial misfortune. Fishermen, having quarreled over who owned the sea, decided to settle the matter with a contest of nets. 2 crews set out at dawn, casting so greedily that their ropes entangled. The boats collided, and both sank in water shallow enough to reveal their folly to everyone on shore. The mayor, in an act of bureaucratic inspiration, proclaimed the tangle ordinance and forbidding the crossing of nets, ropes, or even shoelaces without license. From that day forth, lovers who held hands too tightly risked being cited for entanglement. The century crawled on. Scribes continued to sharpen quills, kings continued to sign decrees, and peasants continued to ignore them. Yet for every ignored commandment another arose. A shepherd's dispute about whose sheep sneezed, first on market day, produced the livestock health notification. A baker's habit of singing off-key gave birth to public noise regulation. 17. An alehouse that brewed beer so strong it felled a knight mid-sentence inspired the ale dilution edict, requiring that every 10th cup be mixed with water for safety. Each new law came with its own seal, ceremony, and promise to maintain the dignity of the realm. None changed anything. The chroniclers of the royal court took these happenings very seriously. In scrolls that wound on like sermons, they recorded every clause, every fine, every date. Reading them was considered a mild form of penance. Scholars from distant lands visited to admire the sheer quantity of regulation and departed with headaches. And somewhere between parchment and pride, the true purpose of law to prevent mischief was lost. It had become a craft in itself, like weaving or candle making. Children were apprenticed to lawyers the way others were apprenticed to smiths. They learned the difference between a bylaw and an ordinance before they could count. Yet amid this soporific order, one final absurdity stood out. In the mountain town of Landor, a minstrel named Owen performed nightly outside the tavern, the Fat Pilgrim. One evening a raven, perhaps offended by his melody, swooped down and stole the ribbon from his lute. Owen, chasing it with noble determination, climbed to the roof, slipped, and landed upon the Lord Bailiff's dinner table during a banquet. The guests scattered, believing some demonic minstrel had fallen from heaven. In the confusion, a candle toppled, setting fire to the bailiff's wig. The aftermath was predictable. A committee, a sermon, and a statute. The Avian Interference Act forbade all musical performances within sight of wild birds. To enforce it, guards patrolled with cages, chasing sparrows away from festivals. No one dared whistle outdoors for 20 years. So passed another age of incident and reaction. The chronicles record not passion, courage, or conquest, but a parade of paperwork, rules about footwear, football, scaffolds, bees, onions, and birds. The empire of boredom expanded, each decree a monument to a single foolish afternoon. And through it all the people trudged onward, bound not by chains or wars, but by signatures and seals. The parchment mountains grew higher than the castles themselves, and historians began to suspect that the kingdom's greatest monument was not stone or steel, but ink. The passing of years did little to loosen the kingdom's affection for bureaucracy. As new generations of officials arrived, each found the shelves already crowded with scrolls that nobody dared to discard. The laws grew like ivy on a crumbling wall, thick, tangled, and impossible to uproot. It was in this spirit that the law of wet cloaks was conceived. The tale began on a gray afternoon in the town of Harrowmere. A scribe named Giles returned from market soaked through with rain. Seeking warmth, he hung his dripping cloak beside the council hearth, not realizing that the chamberlain's prized manuscript lay drying nearby. The water from Giles's cloak ran into the parchment, smearing the ink of an entire year's accounts. The chamberlain, whose sense of proportion rivaled that of an angry hen, declared the act sabotage. He summoned the mayor, who summoned a committee, who summoned witnesses, and by dusk the law of wet cloaks was drafted. It required every citizen to wring garments dry before entering a public building. The rule was enforced by a cloak inspector stationed at the doors of churches and taverns, armed with a towel and an unshakable sense of duty. No sooner had this rule taken root than the town of Wexbury suffered another celebrated misadventure. There, a visiting troupe of jugglers performed for the annual harvest fair. Their leader, known grandly as Thomas the Nimble, juggled torches for the crowd's amusement. During the final flourish, a gust of wind carried one burning brand into the ale tent. The fire spread faster than the audience could applaud. The town burned for 3 days, and Thomas escaped with nothing but a singed hat and an enduring reputation. When the ashes cooled, the elders of Wexbury composed the prohibition of public juggling with combustible objects, a title almost longer than the law itself. In time, it expanded to include candles, fireworks, and even lanterns, effectively banning any outdoor illumination after dusk. Travelers approaching Wexbury at night found it a dark, suspicious place, its citizens squinting through the gloom in perfect compliance. Farther north, in the Shire of Dunford, a tragedy both small and pompous gave birth to the Duck Pond Safety Ordinance. The mayor's son, attempting to impress a lady with his skill at skipping stones, managed to strike a nobleman's reflection instead. The nobleman, mistaking insult for assault, lunged forward, slipped, and landed face first in the pond. He emerged unharmed but furious, declaring that open water was a public menace. Within a week, every pond, ditch, and puddle was surrounded by fences, warning signs, and the occasional guard. Geese were relocated. Ducks protested loudly but without effect. The fences multiplied until travelers began to lose sight of the water entirely. Future generations wondered why their ancestors had enclosed every puddle as if guarding treasure. These decrees, though born of accidents, found immortality in ink. Royal messengers carried copies to distant counties, where other councils, fearing to appear less diligent, adopted them word for word. Thus laws spread not by reason but by imitation, until even villages that had never seen a duck employed a duck pond inspector. During these same years, a curious philosopher named Master Abelard of Fensworth undertook to catalogue every existing regulation. He labored 40 winters on the project, his hair whitening alongside the parchment. When finished, he presented his 12-volume masterpiece, the Compendium of Civic Prudence, to the king himself. His Majesty leafed through the pages, nodded solemnly, and asked if there was a law against compiling too many laws. Abelard, taking the question seriously, drafted one the following morning. It limited the length of all future statutes to 5 clauses and required that any scribe who exceeded the limit pay a fine of 1 goose. Within a month, there were addendums explaining the size of the goose, its color, its origin, and who might collect it. The law against long laws became longer than all that preceded it. In such an atmosphere, absurdity became routine. In Bristol, a merchant complained that street musicians attracted pickpockets, resulting in the Ballad Restriction Order, which banned songs of more than 4 verses. In Chester, the regulation of church bells limited ringing to 2 peals per hour after one monk developed a persistent headache. In Sussex, a nobleman bitten by his own falcon insisted that all birds of prey wear small hoods during daylight, giving rise to a brief but memorable fashion among the gentry. And so the chronicles continue, laws breeding laws, parchments breeding boredom. Historians centuries later would marvel not at the brilliance of kings or the valor of knights, but at the endless patience of clerks who copied the same nonsense without protest. By now the realm was so smothered in order that chaos itself seemed exotic. The people, worn down by rules, no longer rebelled. They simply shrugged, signed the register, and carried on. Life became an exercise in cautious obedience. To breathe was permitted, but only if one avoided excessive sighing within earshot of a magistrate. As winter came, the officials met again in their echoing chambers. They read their decrees aloud by candlelight, nodding in solemn satisfaction at the perfection of their system. Somewhere outside, peasants trudged through the snow, blissfully unaware of half the regulations that governed them. And perhaps that ignorance was their only freedom. By the dawn of the 15th century, the realm had grown old beneath the weight of its own parchment. The scribes could no longer count the number of laws they had copied. Even the ink itself seemed tired. The archives of Westminster were said to stretch so far that a man could be lost inside them and die of boredom before finding the door again. In this age of solemn order, there arose one final, ridiculous affair. The sort of accident that only happens when too many people are trying to behave correctly. It began with the festival of St. Mildred, a day when every town competed to display its obedience and piety. In the capital, the mayor ordered that each guild march in procession, wearing the garments approved by their respective statutes. The tailors arrived in shoes of exactly 2 inches point. The bakers carried their diluted ale, and the beekeepers paraded their sealed jars. Behind them came the scaffolding inspectors, cloak ringers, duck pond guardians, and at least 3 men responsible for measuring the length of ribbons on lutes. The crowd applauded politely, though no one could remember why. Trumpets blared. Bells rang twice, for fear of breaking the law limiting peals per hour, and the air was thick with ceremony. Then came the incident. At the front of the line marched a delegation from the Guild of Candlemakers. They carried an enormous ceremonial candle, so tall that it scraped the lintels of every gate. The bearers, anxious not to extinguish it, tilted it dangerously forward as they passed the reviewing stand. A spark drifted onto the mayor's robe, a fine wool garment recently certified under the Textile Purity Regulation of 1397. The fabric caught fire at once. In panic, an inspector of cloaks attempted to douse the flames with a bucket of water. Unfortunately, The bucket was borrowed from the beekeeper's wagon, and the water was thick with honey. The mayor, sticky and furious, stumbled backward into the delegation of Fletchers, who were demonstrating arrows for the archery discipline mandate. The arrows scattered, several pierced the 2-inch shoes of the tailors, and one frightened horse broke free of its bridle, overturning the platform of the musical guild. A lute, properly licensed, its ribbon of lawful width, flew through the air and struck the Royal Herald Square on the head. In the confusion, the trumpeters resumed playing, thinking it was part of the performance. The crowd, uncertain whether this was ceremony or calamity, began to cheer. When the smoke cleared, half the city square was in ruin. The mayor's dignity was irretrievable, and the archives had gained yet another chapter of lunacy. A commission was formed immediately, its purpose to prevent any future festival irregularities. Over 3 months of debate, they produced the General Ordinance for the Prevention of All Future Accidents, a law so vast it attempted to govern everything not already governed. It required that 1. No public event be held without written permission from at least 3 offices. 2. All candles be inspected for moral soundness. 3. Shoes of any length be considered suspicious unless certified by a cordwainer of noble lineage. 4. Music be performed only in silence to avoid the risk of noise. 5. Every citizen submit a weekly list of things they might accidentally do, so these could be preemptively forbidden. When the ordinance was read aloud, it took 2 entire days. The clerk fainted twice. No one understood a word, but all agreed it was magnificent. And thus the kingdom achieved its ultimate triumph, complete regulation. For the first time in memory, every possible action, thought, and breath had been neatly assigned to some rule. The people were perfectly safe, perfectly supervised, and perfectly miserable. Historians later noted that no further laws were ever written after that. There was simply nothing left to forbid. The scribes laid down their quills. The inspectors packed their rulers, and silence settled over the land like dust upon a closed book. Centuries passed. The parchment turned brittle, the ink faded, and the archives were forgotten. When later ages uncovered the yellowed scrolls, they laughed, quietly of course, in case laughter itself was still illegal. And so ended the long saga of the medieval laws that only existed because of one insane incident, or rather, because of 1,000 small, foolish ones stitched together by time. The laws crumbled, the people changed, but the habit remained. The endless human desire to regulate nonsense in the name of order. In that sense, the medieval world never truly vanished. It merely moved forward in disguise, filing new papers, stamping new seals, and still searching somewhere between reason and absurdity for the perfect rule to keep life tidy.